Roll here. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Librairie, Bron and Quarterly's virtual spring event series. My name is Tracy Hearn, and I'm the senior editor at Bron and Quarterly. And I'm honored to introduce Eli as we launch her comic Stone Fruit with special guest Eli Tareq El Bechelany-Lynch. I want to start by mentioning that our bookstore is located on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. While many of us refer to Montreal as our home, its name is Tjougt'jag'é. We're grateful that creating and sharing stories has been a part of this land for thousands of years, and we urge you to seek out a story that is different from your own. Tonight, we're going to start with a conversation between Lee and Eli, followed by a Q&A. For registered Zoom participants, you will be able to write questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Our bookstore ships Canada-wide, delivers by bike here locally, and offers prepared pickups and limited in-store browsing. We have copies of Stone Fruit and Eli's book, Not Body, which I actually just lent out my copy, so I can't show you. But Lee actually illustrated the cover for that, and it's gorgeous. The book is gorgeous inside and out. Anyway, both books are available for order online and in store. Thank you so much for supporting local independent bookstores like ours. Eli Tareq Eli Tareq El Bechelany-Lynch is a queer Arab poet living in Tjougt'jag'é, unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. Their work has appeared in the Best Canadian Poetry 2018 collection, Guts, Carte Blanche, The Shade Journal, The New Quarterly, Arc Poetry Magazine, Room Magazine, and more. They have a new book, The Good Arabs, coming out next fall. Eli also used to work for us as a bookseller and event coordinator, and we're very happy to have you here tonight, Eli. And Leeli. Leeli is an Australian cartoonist and illustrator living in Tjougt'jag'é. As a comics community, I'm going to just go ahead and speak for the entire community. We've been eagerly awaiting Lee's debut graphic novel, Stone Fruit, which, as Jillian Tamaki noted in her blurb, marks the entrance of a major new comics talent. We're grateful for this beautiful and generous comic, for its depictions of feral childhood play, for its depictions of queer relationships, for its success in being a book about queer characters, or about, for a book with queer characters, not a book that is about being queer, which is harder to find in comics these days than I would like. And for its depictions of complicated, messy family dynamics, and the many ways we love. I could go on and on about this book. Lee's cartooning is mesmerizing, and the book turned out gorgeously. So congrats, Lee. And with that, please join me in your homes in welcoming Lee and Eli to your screens.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks for that intro, Tracy. That was really nice. Tracy also provided some really great line edits on that book when it was still in manuscript stage. And I took the edits, and I think the book has benefited from it.
All right, well, I'm like, how do you start this? Hi, I'm Eli, not Levi. There you go, your book.
Do I have to hold it?
Just for a little bit.
A little bit, okay.
Just to say hello so people know what your book looks like.
That's true.
All right, well, I'm just gonna dive into some questions, and you can put the book down whenever you want.
I just want to note we're also in Eli's bedroom, and we both got tested.
Oh yes.
So we're being responsible COVID participants right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, we just thought that it would be cozier to get to be together if, you know, we could do it safely, and it feels very nice to be in the space with Lee to launch her beautiful book. Very proud of her. And so I'm like really stoked to be asking her the hard-hitting questions. So I'm just gonna start off. Let's see. Well, I mean, Tracy mentioned writing, like your book writing about like monstrous, playful childhood. So I kind of wanted to ask you about writing about kids, or writing kids in a comic, or in any kind of narrative. And kind of how you go about writing kids, because I think we've talked about it before, but writing kids is really hard.
It's so hard. The
Yeah.
dialogue is so much harder.
And
I mean, it's like ostensibly it should be easier, but it's...
yeah. I mean, especially if you're trying to write, like, your Nessie in the book is quite smart and she like knows what's going on, but then she also is still a child, and I think you did that really well. And I guess I want you to talk about how you went about that.
Right. Oh God. I mean, I started writing Nessie. Like I start writing, I mean, I'm talking like I've been working for years, and I have not. So far in the time that I've been making comics, I feel out a character before I want to dive into a larger project with them by writing a bunch of vignettes. And so I guess a few years ago now, I wanted to write a child character. I'd never done it before. I love children, and I was going through a bunch of parenting feels at the time about just like, do I want to be a parent? Do I not? I think those are conversations that probably around the time we met, I was like, talk about this with me.
I was like, I don't understand. I do not want kids. I never wanted kids. I like kids. I'm not a kid hater, just to be clear.
And like, also, honestly, like, if I'm going to be surrounded by a bunch of millennial homos, there's not a ton of people it's like you can talk about that with, because generally it seems to be the unanimous thing that people don't want kids. Or it's like more rare, maybe.
It's also more difficult for a lot of people.
Legit. So anyway, I started writing these little vignettes of someone around my age, just like a gay woman in her millennial years, of like mid-20s or something, hanging out with a 6-year-old, and just like kind of fantasizing about what kind of conversations they have together, how this, ardent left-wing gay woman with all of her anger and all of her restlessness was able to talk about the world honestly to a 6-year-old, and how that's supposed to look. And then also what kind of impact a small fiery little child is going to have on someone who's got a lot of magical thinking in their own right, as a queer woman. And so I wrote a few things, partly because also I think the main way to get paid is as a cartoonist is writing little vignettes and then submitting them to journals. At least that's been my experience, and so that's also the motivator for these things. But establishing their relationship was the kind of the seed of writing this larger story, and then building on the relationships outside of that. And then I think that the more characters that I've built around this central relationship, which didn't even become the central relationship by the end of the process, also affected how Nessie turned out. Because she's responding, like they're all responding to her and she's responding to them. And so I think that like built her personality as a result of that too.
Like in relation to the other characters.
Yeah, like how she interacts with Amanda, who's the mother. Like she's different ways with Amanda because she's also kind of managing Amanda's insecurities and fragilities and neuroses. And so she's a lot more calm and soothing as far as how off tap a 6-year-old can be than when she's with Bron, who I feel like brings her out the most. It
was like a really sweet thing to see her get to be two different people, kind of almost. And I think we don't often get that personality out of children in books, or if we do, it's a very successful endeavor, but I don't see it very often where you're like getting this perspective of a child navigating two different spaces. Usually those spaces are between adult and child, right? Like other children, which I think we kind of understand more. Whereas I think you did a really good job of like having her play against even different adults, which was fun.
Thanks.
I
think the code switching is something that people learn really young. Like before I left Australia, I was working in a kitchen with a 13-month-old.
Mhm.
And she had her way of being with me and the other kitchen staff. Like we were really just constantly doting on her, and she'd nap in the corner when the
Right.
shift was busy and things like that. But it was a cafe, and there was like a walkway between the kitchen and the front of house. And she would come into the front of house, and it was a bunch of mostly like hippies and hipsters
Mhm.
who went to that cafe. And she had a way of like a fake smiling. This 13-month-old who can just walk and can't talk yet.
Yeah.
Like she had a way of fake smiling to the patrons
Right.
who'd come in and try and touch her when she didn't want to be touched.
Yeah.
And we were like shocked.
Like, how is she doing this?
Clever.
That's so fun. Well, I guess I want to, if we keep going and talking about Nessie and like her character in the story, I feel like I really love the parts where she becomes a literal monster. And this moment where like realism starts bleeding into kind of more of a magic or like fantasy realm, but doesn't go very far in it. And no one discusses it. Like no one knows about it, but then you're like she's in her play world and we're there with her. And I wonder if you can talk more about the choice to have just a little snippet of that kind of magic fantasy aspect without, fully going into it.
Yeah. I mean, I think compared to a lot of artists that I really admire, I don't actually think I have that much imagination. So the fact that there's only a little bit of magic is probably more of like my limit. I've hit my limit more than like, yes, I'm being very strategic about the ways that I inject this storytelling tool in there.
Right.
But
I mean, it works.
know,
whether or not it
works,
was intentional, it does work.
But I think on that, like I think because it feels like or it felt, I mean it still feels this way, it feels and it felt like a difficult thing for me. I think I went into the project being like, I want to use this as an opportunity to figure out something that I don't know how to do. Like conceiving of what the monsters even look like was excruciatingly difficult. And then I would dread every scene. Not writing, it was a joy to write them. Like just writing out the script, it was so pleasurable. But when it came to drawing it out, I dreaded anticipating the monster scenes because it was just so hard. But it was also so fun.
Did you look at, because I know you work a lot with reference photos and like you'll like Google like a bus to like really look at the bus to be able to draw the bus, right?
You've seen me Google a bus.
Yes, I've seen you Google a bus. I've seen you Google Maps like a whole street, and I was like, oh, that's really fun.
Tommy told me that one.
Yeah,
very good. Google
very
Street View. Yeah.
I've done it for like inserting certain areas into my poems. I'll like Google Street View and be like, wait, where was that thing? So it's really fun. But where was I going with that?
Oh, like references.
Did you have references for the monsters?
No, and I think that's the issue. Like it requires more of your brain in that sense, like more of your like more pure invention in that sense. And I mean, I don't generally approach my work with expectations of originality. Like I don't really care if something's original or not. Like as long as it's interesting and engaging, I don't think it matters. So I wasn't going into it being hell-bent on creating a monster that had never been seen before, because that doesn't exist anymore. Like people have been creating monsters forever and they look great. And like there's no need to necessarily make more that look like no other monster that ever was before. So I think I was just looking at a bunch of monster designs that I liked, and trying to boil it down to something that felt honest to what I wanted to do with it, which is showing like, I don't know, some kind of physical manifestation of a lack of inhibition.
Makes sense. I guess kind of on a thread of like intentionality, I'm kind of thinking about the ways that you set up your panels in like juxtaposition to each other, and the way that you use color. And often you'll have like these scenes or like these pages full of like more muted, like really like sparse drawings, and then you'll go like with the blue. It is gouache, right? It's gouache. It is like, ooh. I had like written it in my notes and been like, wait a second. I hope it's gouache because otherwise I sound silly. Anyways, but like the more like the panels that are like full on with color, and I mean you only use certain colors, but it still fills up that panel.
Mhm.
And I wonder at the idea to have that juxtaposition,
Mhm.
and whether it was about the emotional arc or the emotional process that was going on for the characters, or was it more about the visual? Was it like purely aesthetic where you were like, I think this looks nice, and like I like the way they look in opposition.
I mean, I think I was saying to you before we started recording, like one of the fun things about doing promo, which I've never done before, and doing like interviews and stuff, is that you get to hear people's feedback on the book. And people keep like asking questions in the form of their interpretations of the story,
Right.
and like telling me things that they've noticed about like my choices.
Right.
Oh God, I didn't do that on purpose. Like genuinely, I did the selective background thing where some of the backgrounds are in gouache and some of them are black and white just with lines and very little else, because I wanted a bit of an eye breather for some of them. Like I think some of them just you don't need that. Like there's I really like panels to have not too much dialogue because I'm a bad reader and I don't want to read more than I have to in a single panel. It's a bit of a put off,
Right.
And also then there's just some real banger lines where you don't want anything to water that down. You want a single panel with like one heavy hitting piece of dialogue that hopefully gets you.
Yeah.
And then you just the person's expression in that panel says a lot, hopefully. And those kinds of things, I don't think they need a background. I don't think it contributes anything. And at least in my experience of just life, there is those moments where you're so sucked into a conversation that the things around you, the atmospheric details,
are like blurred.
They kind of melt away. But I was doing a talk with Jen, who's the marketing person at Fantagraphics this morning, and she was like, I really noticed that in the it was really interesting that you did this thing where you like made a lot of Amanda and Ray's scenes once the couple in the story split apart, and then they go on their separate trajectories for the majority of the story, where they're connecting with their siblings, which are like respective bits. And she said that in the scenes where Amanda and Ray, who are sisters, are connecting, that heaps of those scenes have like a lot of gouache backgrounds and they're quite weighty. Whereas Bron in her family, who are like the white Christian wasps, and like her situation is kind of going worse. Like she's connecting with her sister, but her parents are keeping like distant, at arm's length, and just their whole way of connecting is more difficult, and there's more stacked against Bron to get an authentic experience of the people that she's trying to connect to. And all of like a majority of those scenes are done in just black and white. There isn't a ton of gouache there. And I'm still quite sure that I didn't do it on purpose, but I think it's convenient for the sake of the story that there's ways of interpreting that.
Yeah. I also think that as artists, and this is my like wooey side of me.
Go woo. Pitch the woo.
Well, I mean, it's particularly present in poetry, I think, and that's the medium I work in the most, but I think it goes throughout different mediums that like the intuitive choices we make often run along the lines of the emotional or the arc of the story, especially once you get tuned into how to write a story and how to like in your case how to both write a story and illustrate in tandem. I think those choices, you're being coy or like kind of like about it and being like, it wasn't my choice, I don't think I did on purpose, but I think it's interesting to think about these choices that we make when like kind of subconsciously and how they come out to like make the book work. I think that works in your book.
It reminds me of when you start deconstructing and making transparent the social decisions you make. When you like enter a room full of people, or when you're entering a one-on-one dynamic with someone where you're constantly making small and intentional decisions to create a mood or make someone feel comfortable or make yourself feel comfortable, or like survival strategies to like full manipulation, like anywhere along that spectrum. There's all these micro decisions about like the ways that you're choosing to be in a space with in relation to something or someone else, and like when you spell them all out, it looks sociopathic.
Right.
But when you're just doing it intuitively, it there's still a logic to it, and there's still
Yeah.
intention without it necessarily being like full front brain
Yeah, like full thinking
decision
about-
making.
yeah. Well, I think that speaks to like when you've been doing work for a long time, and I think you, once again, you're like, I haven't been doing this for a long time, but you have been working towards your practice. You have been like building a practice and kind of like deciding what your style is going to be, or like experimenting with that, right?
Yeah.
Which I would also like to talk about, like how
Good segue.
how you got to your style, and how you kind of like, was it like always the case, or like that it looked like this? Was it like a lot of like going through being like, I hate this, I want to look more like this?
Right.
Was it like looking at other people and being like, I wish I was that,
All the time.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
know?
Show me an artist that doesn't do that sometimes.
So I'm curious
Often.
about like how you got, because I think this kind of question, I think, is like important for other people who are trying to start. It's
Yeah.
like pretty intimidating, and then when you hear people whose work you admire, which I'm sure a lot of people do, it's nice, to be like, oh, this person like whose work is like really beautiful and I love, also had a hard time starting.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
I would like for you to talk about that a bit.
I mean, there's like a suite of cartoonists who I've loved since I was a teenager, and whose work I still aggressively eyeball, being like, how do they do it? It's just, oh. But I think there's also a point where I just have to accept that my hand moves across a page the way it will. There's things I cannot do and probably will never be able to do, like artists I admire. And there's things I can do quite intuitively that may be hard for somebody else. I don't know. I think like there's an interesting, like, I mean, at its core, I think that a style is developed for most people by just drawing a lot or by writing a lot or whatever. Like you just, I think it can't be thought about too hard, like, because if there's too much intent, like there has to be intention behind everything, but if there's too much intention, it becomes stilted or something.
Or like overwrought, or like obvious, like the moves behind it become obvious,
and like a bit on the nose or something like that. But that's also, I mean, that's valuable. I feel like a lot of like the times I've worked with teenagers, which like when I first came here, I used to do these educational workshops in Canadian schools doing like murals, and you'd see a lot of teenagers, like it's like they're putting on a suit, they're trying on a style, and that shit is formative too. Like I did a lot of copying artists' work when I was younger, and sometimes still, just to see how it feels. But I think for the most part, there's certain stylistic decisions that I made early on and then just developed a habit around, like the little peanut eyes that I use, like beady little peanut eyes. I find that they enable the expressions I want to that I want in my characters' faces. I think I read a review recently, like a just someone out in the world on Instagram was like, why do they have peanut eyes?
You're like,
I know that one of them's Asian, but like they all look like that.
Oh my God.
I cackled. But like, I don't know, there's certain things like that where I'm like, okay, I did that on purpose at some point and then it just stuck, and now I'm stuck with that maybe forever. But like, I think there's also things like trends in illustration, which is an interesting piece that I probably talk about a lot. When I was growing up in the 90s, line work was a really big deal. Like Quentin Blake for Roald Dahl's illustrations was a really big deal, like lots of scratchy lines. Shel Silverstein, have you read Shel Silverstein? He does these gorgeous, like artists who probably never put a pencil down before they put the pen down, and they just have this like internal genius that tells you exactly where to put the line. And so line work was a really big deal when I was a kid, and so I think I understood line work a lot as the way to draw, and how, like, what skillful drawing looks like, what good draftsmanship looks like is sophisticated lines. And I really wonder what it's like for the kids now who are starting to draw, because illustration trends has moved a lot towards no lines at all, block colors, much more like graphic design meets illustration, like lots of like big bloopy figures in like really interesting earthy tones and stuff. And I'm wondering how that's going to affect like illustrators and cartoonists coming up in the next 10 years, where they internalize that trend, and then the front of the curve moves on from there. And
We
so
still
like
see
in a
that
lot of, yeah.
in the background, yeah.
And I think like in a lot of ways, I don't think my work is very trendy. I think it's kind of
Mm.
dorky because I think it's kind of old school in its cartooning sensibilities. But it works for me. And I think, at least for right now, I didn't know I liked writing until quite recently. Like until this book and trying a long form thing, I didn't know I actually really enjoyed dialogue and character building and like figuring out the beats of a story and figuring out pacing. Like I didn't really know what the research looked like and how like drafts worked and all this stuff that now just like sets me aflame and I want to talk about it all the time. Like I was just obsessed with drawing.
Yeah.
And the writing was a means to an end. And so aesthetic style stuff, like I feel like I put it on the back burner. And as long as the art can do what the writing is asking it to do, like as long as I can draw an elevator and like a person in a room that looks like they're actually standing in the room and not on top of the room, you know, like as long as it's not distracting and like ruining the story, I think the art has kind of just plateaued for me. And style is not something I'm like actively thinking about right now, but I'm sure there's going to be a point where I get sick of drawing in this way and like might take a break, like a sabbatical or something, and do some research and like, you know, see what new images and artists can kind of invade in, because I think when you let yourself get more porous to style and allow things to come influence you in that way, there's quite a quick response time, you know.
It's interesting because I think, well, something I remember you telling me is that you, now that you've figured out your style and you've figured out, you know, how things should look and like the colors you're choosing, that now you can rely on that to be like the easier thing, like to be the thing kind of in the background, and you don't have to like think as much about it, so you can focus on other aspects because you've worked at that.
I mean, worked out, like
worked on it, like worked towards a place where it feels comfortable to draw this way, and more like intuitive, I would say.
It's like, yes, I like this brush, I like this paper, this is how I draw bodies, kind of feel like this is how I build a form out of shapes, like that, that kind of stuff.
That like maybe makes it easier to then like kind of rely on it to move forward, and and like, you know, that it's going to be solid.
I mean, it's still constantly shifting. Hopefully less so than in this book. Like the drawing process of this book took 2 years, I think. I mean, you were there for the whole time.
Yes, I was.
Okay, was it 2 years?
I think so.
Roughly, I'd say. And by the end of the 2 years, I had to go back to the first 20 to 40 pages and Photoshop all of the heads. I had to cut them off, like a majority of them, I think, and stick copied versions of the later heads in the later chapters because they were unrecognizable.
That's so fun. I didn't know that.
Really? Maybe it felt like a bit of a dirty secret at the time. I felt like I was cheating.
Now you're telling everyone about your dirty laundry. That's so fun. Well, I want to veer actually back into narrative, because you're saying, you know, this is something you like to talk about, so we could talk about it. So I'm interested, you explained a bit how Ray and Bron kind of go on 2 separate paths. You know, you start the story off, you're like, oh, this is a story about a relationship between these 2 queers. They babysit Ray's niece every Tuesday and Sunday, I think. No, Saturday, Tuesday and Saturday.
You're remembering better than me.
Yeah, I was looking at it today. And you know, when you, I mean, I didn't have this experience because I was there for a lot of your process, but I imagine going into this, you're like, oh, it's a story. If you didn't read the copy, I guess, you're like, oh, it's a story about a relationship. It's about these 2 characters and how they are together. And then all of a sudden it completely shifts, where there's a breaking point, and then they both move away from each other, right? And they're doing their own thing, and they're trying to deal with their family dynamics. And I guess I wonder about, well, we were talking about the term misdirection earlier, when we were just chatting.
Explaining what misdirection was. She should now tell the class.
Well, just like when a writer like kind of takes you down a path and you assume you're going one way, or it doesn't have to be a writer, it could be any kind of artist, but often applies to narrative, and you're going down one path and you think, oh, this is where I'm going, and then they're like, never mind, boop, and like really take you on a different path. And I think, I mean, the book doesn't do misdirection in like a really intense way, but it's like a subtle kind of thing where you're like, oh, it's about this relationship, and they're no, it's actually like, it is about the relationships, but it's not really about the relationship between the two queers. That relationship happened before the book,
Right.
you know, and then we end up with these two characters trying to like come back to their families in different ways.
Right.
And I guess I want you to talk a bit about that choice, and you know, whether you started off thinking that, whether you intentionally did that, or it was just kind of the way the story led you.
Right. I mean, full transparency, Eli shared this question with me before when we were sitting on the balcony. And they'd fully forgotten the edits they'd given me. Like early on in the process, when I just finished writing the first 2 chapters. Like when how do I say this all at once? Anyway, I told them that they were planting a question in there specifically to so they could highlight that they'd provide an indispensable edit.
Oh my god, I honestly
but they forgot. So this is just something
I
for me
fully
to
forgot.
say. But when I gave you the first two chapters, and I told you what the plan was for the book, because at that point I had written the entire book as a script, and I was beginning to draw it out, but I was not convinced by my own script at that point. I think I was like, there still felt like there was little holes all throughout the script, and even though it came to the same resolution and I wanted that ending and I was kind of gunning for it, the whole middle bit was like
now I'm remembering,
wobbly.
It's coming back.
And then you read the first 2 chapters, and then you asked me what I had planned for the next 2 chapters, I guess, or the next large amount of space. And I told you, and originally in the first version of the script, it just follows Ray, because Ray was also just the character I was more familiar with and more comfortable with. This kind of like the ways that Bron was, and also her dynamic with her family was the most foreign aspect of the book to me. I don't know enough about like that, like white waspy Christian suburbia. Like it's exotic to me. It's fascinating, but I don't actually know how to write about it intimately. And so I was avoiding it at that time. And so the comic just did this big kind of swoop around it, and there was this hole where like Bron just disappears into this like unknown place, which I think from Ray's perspective, that is exactly what happens. But for the sake of reading it, it's holy. And so I think when you gave it back to me, you were like, where does Ron go? Where does Bron go? Like it's
Ron.
She's actually a really interesting character, and I want to know what happens to her. I think you were like, in fact, she's more interesting than Ray. I was like, oh god, and God forbid I write a boring book. So I made a bunch of decisions on the spot, I think, after that point to split the story. And it was also really fun, because then it became an exercise in figuring out how to ping pong between 2 different storylines, and scene transitions are so fun to figure out how to write. I was looking at Adrian Tamina's work a lot in shortcomings. I still look at that book all the time, because he's so masterful at bouncing between scenes and showing multiple scenes. And I was watching a lot of movies at that point too, because they just cut between characters really well visually, and use things like sound, which is harder in a comic but not impossible, to carry through and like, you know, stitch across scenes without it being too abrupt. But anyway, so like I started wanting to write about a breakup because at the time the experience of, you know, planning, capital P, planning your life with someone that you're in love with and that you're in a relationship with, and then that breaking and falling apart I experienced that for the first time, and it was astronomically big. It was just like a very big experience, and it was something I wanted to write about without being too schmoopy about it. And like I knew I didn't want it to be necessarily the biggest thing in the story, but I wanted to touch on that because it felt like the most emotionally vivid thing in my life. And then from there, as I started writing the sisters, I think particularly I was interested in Amanda.
Right.
Like she was one of the most interesting characters to me, and she's also like, even now I'm fond of her so much as a fake person that doesn't actually exist. Like I really like her.
Yeah.
And I like the ways in which she's incredibly compassionate and also quite shit.
Yeah.
And quite antagonistic.
Yeah.
And so I think like I was very excited. I was like very much hustling from the beginning. The reward was getting to the scenes where Ray and Amanda are hanging out, and the ice is melting between them. Like writing about semi-estrangement and like a lot of prickliness when actually both people are quite keen to connect, but just don't know how, and they're like too much in the habit of not connecting and keeping each other at a prickly distance. Like that was a real pleasure to write. And so I think like the whole book was just these strings of things I wanted and I wanted to poke at and I wanted to try my hand at, and then it was just a matter of kind of stitching it together and then filling in all the holes.
So I think we probably have time. I want to try for 2 more questions, and then what we'll do is we'll go to the Q&A. And so there's a button called Q&A at the bottom, and I think there's already some questions, but if you have questions for Lee about her book or whatever, maybe not whatever, but you know, we can focus on the book and cartooning, then, you know, ask them there, and maybe not in the chat because I won't be able to find them. So even if you've asked a question in the chat, just go back, put it in the Q&A, and then I'll be able to find it. But I want to do 2 more questions before we get to that. And I'm thinking about how you were talking about Amanda being like really prickly, but also caring a lot. And I was wondering about, like, I think all of your characters are really nuanced. And I think this is like something we've also talked about a lot. Writing characters that don't just feel like 2-dimensional evil characters. I think that's the hardest. Like, I think people have a easier time writing nuanced characters that are like good, quote unquote. But then once you have like a character that's more doing things that's unforgivable or doing things that's hurting other people, it becomes harder to make them nuanced while also not belittling that hurt.
Totally.
Which I think you do a good job of in the book. I love your like bashful face. Every time I say something nice, you're like, "Ooh, thank you."
It's a party. Oh, my face. So glad we're super far away from
Yeah, it is nice. I'm hiding it amongst my plants. Yeah. But I think you do that well, and I guess I wonder how you work through trying to create nuanced characters and building characters, because I think that happens with Bron's family as well, which I think would be harder even, because I think based on what you're saying, like the Amanda character or like Ray and Amanda's family feels more familiar for you. And then even like when I remember when you were writing Bron's family, it was like you're trying to figure that out.
I was wandering around screaming at my raised white suburban friends.
Yes.
How does it work?
Tell me all about it.
Tell me about wasp culture.
And so obviously, like you know, coming at a place where you like already don't know the thing, and then you're also trying to make these characters nuanced, which I think is like pretty great, because 2-dimensional characters end up being boring and too representative of something, you know. They're like a metaphor more than a person. I think you never fall into that, and so I guess I wonder how you go about doing that. Like, what are the questions you ask yourself? Like, how do you decide, okay, this character is now fleshed out and not just a little, you know, metaphor for something, you know? Even like a metaphor for whiteness. I think that that you could fall into that with writing WASP culture or writing WASP characters.
And then you're kind of making a point. It does feel kind of harmful to make a point from a character. Like it's like bringing a person into life just for the sake of making a point. Feels a bit rude, you know? But okay, so it's a good question, because I think it's one I've been thinking about a lot, because I'm building a whole new set of characters now. And one of the things that was helpful, I mean, the entire time I was drawing this and ostensibly rewriting it at that point, I was in the studio, and the studio is a large pottery studio in St. Henry that one of my best friends, Wyanne, runs. And Tommy was there, you were there, Soraya was there, like a bunch of friends were in that space at the time that I was working on the book. And I was just screaming at you all constantly and making you read different versions and looking at panels being like, how do I draw this? Can you tell what's happening in this panel?
Right.
And like gossiping about the characters, like there was more or less real people, was very helpful. And it did motivate rewriting scenes and changing scenes so that the characters were reflected in a different light. Like another great edit was that I was talking about Amanda with Tommy, and they were like, I imagine that she's quite jealous of...
Who's Tommy?
Sorry, Tommy Parrish. Small plug. They wrote The Lie and How We Told It. They're also working on another book right now, which is extremely beautiful, that is coming out of Fantagraphics in the future at some point. But we were talking about Amanda, and they were like, I imagine that Amanda's probably quite jealous of Bron and Ray, because they don't have to take on a lot of the responsibility of like the day-to-day dirt with Nessie, but they can be these like super fun, cool aunts that drop in twice a week and, you know, get to inject all of this like no strings attached joy. And that conversation led to the scene where Ray tries to peace out from babysitting responsibilities for a little bit because she's really heartbroken, and Amanda's like, get the fuck out of here.
I like that conversation.
It was a very fun conversation to write. And so yeah, I think like gossiping about characters has been a really great tool in my life for imagining all of their angles, you know, and all of their motivations. You know, being like, would they do this? Would they say this? You know?
Yeah.
With people who were also getting to know them and helping me decide names and, you know, like looks as well, like all the things, what they would wear, how they would present. There was a point to this. I can't remember what it was.
I think you made it.
Yeah.
Your point was write in community and have your people, have your people who you write with and who you think with, because it's important to have like bounce. What's the word?
People like surfaces to bounce off. I don't know. There's a term. You've forgotten it, so I've forgotten it. Never mind.
It'll come to me.
It's gonna come at the wrong moment. Maybe talking about something else.
The talk's gonna end, and we're gonna be like, ah! Anyways, go ahead.
Oh fuck.
Do you want to go to
that? Okay. So being self-critical was also a huge thing.
Right.
Like, I think I have had, you know, a lot of ideas about like, if you just try hard enough, you don't cause harm. You know, if you have the right intentions, you don't cause harm.
Yeah.
And then fucking doing it anyway, just like making the most terrible messes of things. You know, like I think being in my 20s and like you know, growing up has been like a lot of exercises in humility.
Right.
And like respecting kind of my own limits of like how much you can try versus how much you can do. And I think because of that, and because of seeing, you know, wonderful people around me making terrible decisions also, you know, seeing someone you love causing harm, I think has been for me a very transformative thing. And also loving people and causing harm has been very transformative for me in understanding just how to be in community, how to be in relationships, like how to forgive myself and other people, how to like have expectations of what commitment looks like, what building looks like, all these things. And I think as a result of that, I wanted to write characters who generally have the best intentions and just are fucking up anyway, you know, like can't make it work. Like it was important to me to write a breakup when neither of them really want to break up, where the love is still there, but they just can't make it work. And it's the same for the siblings as well. Like everyone really wants to stay in connection, but you can't always make it work.
I guess I'm like hard segue, but I'm coming back to something that you were talking about, because I think it relates. Like I'm thinking about Amanda again, but also like scenes between Bron and Ray, and like just scenes of anger. I think you represent anger really well. And recently I was talking to Helen, who was in a workshop where there was a week where the workshop was talking about anger, and the workshop leader was saying like anger is really hard to write, and a lot of people don't go there because they have a hard time. Well, her theory is like, oh, maybe they have a hard time accessing anger themselves.
Right.
And so it makes it harder to write. Maybe like it's just writing anger feels somehow like more of a challenge, whereas like writing sadness is, you know, we have like the sad white boy who like
romanticism of the
yeah,
sadness,
yeah, exactly. There's like a romanticism around sadness that like makes it easier to write, you know, like when I was coming to like writing as a teen, you know, all my stuff was like some of it was very funny, I would say. I give my small self some credit, but you know, there was a lot of sad stuff because I was listening to sad music and I was like, this is how you express feeling.
You still listen to sad music?
Of course I do. This is not about me, it's about you. But yeah, like I think anger is something that we all fear, you know, and we fear as a society, but we also, there's so much anger and anger repression. So I think it's fun to read it in different mediums and like in different stories. And I wonder how you wrote about anger and like whether it came from your own experience of feeling anger. Like, did you have to feel angry to write it, or was it more like another experience of imagining beyond yourself? To tie it back to Nessie.
I mean, I think it was imagining beyond myself, because I think in a lot of ways I certainly struggle to express anger. And I think it doesn't help in a lot of ways that most people do around me too. Like I think I'm beginning to find it easier, and it's not a coincidence probably that I'm also surrounded by other people who are beginning to kind of cautiously step into expressing that. And so I think it's always just helpful to put in writing what you're kind of workshopping in your life generally. I don't think there's a lot of anger in Stone Fruit. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, but there are like moments of anger and like moments, different ways that anger is expressed. Like there's a scene where Ray is like, where Bron leaves. It's like right at the beginning, so it's not really a spoiler, and it's beautiful, so you'll get something out of it, even if I say what happened. But you know, Bron and Ray are trying to like talk while Bron is like bye, and they're outside near the taxi.
Right.
And then Bron leaves in the taxi. There's a really great scene where the taxi man is just like,
watching
what's going on?
This sloopy conversation.
Yeah, which was great. And like Ray's in her underwear, like outside, and then Bron leaves, and she just fully freaks out.
Right.
And screams, but then also cries. So you have these moments of like not necessarily straightforward anger, but I
mean, I don't know when anger is very straightforward, unless it's a habit, which I guess is for some people a thing. But like, I guess I wanted to see anger escaping despite your best efforts, which is often how I see it in my own experience of anger, and like often in the people around me. I think like my understanding of anger, I think the most intentional version of wanting to explore that in the character was probably Bron, because I think Bron has a lot of anger and in a lot of ways is like making herself small and making herself as soft as possible when she's actually got like quite hard bits about her, and like quite cold bits about her too. And I think she has this idea and like maybe this wish of being like very soft and very warm and very accommodating and open and available, and she's just not. And so she's kind of grappling with that at the time when this is all kind of falling apart. And there's a scene where they're playing and they realize they have to go home because Amanda wants Nessie home early, and Bron really fucking cracks it. Like she's simmering away, and then she just like lashes out and swears a bunch and gets real mad. And both Nessie and Ray are kind of appalled and really affronted by it. And she's like immediately ashamed of herself too. And they're both in this kind of emo recovery after that. And I think, it's interesting, the shame piece around that and the containment, because I think like, again, certainly from my own experiences, like you can't just wish something away. Right. Yes. Like you do have to develop a relationship with it.
Like you can't just wish anger away.
Exactly. Among many things. But like I think I started touching on that in this book, and I think I want to keep looking at that because I mean, it was so interesting to me when you said that there isn't like the anger is not explored much in writing.
I mean, it might not actually like fully be true, but I think it is something.
Or that it's rare, or that it's not
Well,
necessarily
it's like
common.
yeah, I mean, this is one person who said it. I don't want to be like, we have now.
I want to take it and run because it
Yeah.
serves my curiosity's purpose.
Yeah. And I mean, I asked you the question because I think it is it when I heard that, I was like, yeah, I like hadn't thought about it. And then I was like, oh yeah, seems
Right.
true. But yeah, maybe do you want to take Q&A questions?
Yeah,
I just want to make
absolutely.
sure folks on the other side have a chance to so my phone's not letting me, so I'm gonna disappear here in the
Oh,
side.
you're leaving me alone.
and leaving you alone, and you can
All right.
get you a little closer. All right, I'll be just this voice that will ask some Q&A questions.
I haven't got my glasses on. You have to
Yeah, I'm gonna read, don't worry.
These questions look so long. That's so fun.
I'm just trying to make sure I'm okay. Well, this one's
Sorry, hi, it's Tracy here. Can I just interrupt?
Mhm.
Can you hear me? Can you wait?
Yeah.
I don't know if I need to be on screen. Can you move into the center just for the questions since it's just you?
Okay, I'm gonna sit on this little
Yeah.
poof thing. Is that okay? Oh my god.
well,
Okay.
it's kind of short, so
I
there
can
we go.
see. I can.
You're good.
Okay, I can almost see the screen now.
Okay, maybe we'll start with this more straightforward question and we can move on to other ones too. But do you write the text for your story first, or do you come up with the visuals first? Maybe it's a bit of back and forth, but I'm always curious how folks approach that.
Right. I did the script first. I was in university for a year in this kind of brief course at Concordia in Montreal. And one of the subjects I took was a script writing course. It was mostly for film and TV, but I just went ahead and did a graphic novel. And so the first version of the script was workshopped in that class. And it was really good, actually, because it was the first time I'd allowed other people to read my work without pictures. And I found that pictures are really good at distracting people from any shit writing. And so it was really exposing and really horrifying for me. And I think a really good and important challenge to push myself to write properly, I guess, or write in a way that held up when there is no pictures to show what's going on. I think it helped me figure out how to write dialogue so that characters are distinct from each other, because the initial feedback I got from the script was that everyone sounded the same, which I think is a common thing when people are writing screenplays. So in this situation, I wrote the script first, but I changed it a bunch. By the time I was drawing it, and I was getting a better sense of the characters by drawing them, I ended up rewriting a bunch of pages and like whole scenes. Actually, the book was only meant to be 130 pages, I think, and it grew by 100 pages by the time it was finished.
Cool. Okay, next question.
Next question.
Now I don't have to have segues because not my questions. All right, so Lee, congratulations and thank you for making the work you make. I love hearing you talk. I think this is Celie.
Hey, no, it's C.
Oh, it's C.
Hi,
yes.
C.
I love hearing you talk with such fondness and attentive care about your characters. Does your affection for them ever complicate writing them, i.e. not wanting bad things to happen to them or them to make bad choices? Congrats again. Little
Thanks,
heart.
It's such a sweet question. I feel like I have an evil answer. Like, no, it doesn't. I want to put them through terrible, terrible things. I think I start with terrible things though. Like, I think I generally have a sense of what I want the actions to be, which are like often testing, like it's challenging the characters and making them challenge who they thought they were and who they want to be. And so if I start with the worst outcomes that they're going to experience first and I grow the character around that, I think the affection for the characters comes as I see them, I mean, usually trying to do their best. I'm really not interested in writing villains. I'm writing my first villain right now. I'm writing like basically one of my old bosses in a restaurant who's just this awful, simpering, stringy white man who thinks he's a nice man and he's actually just a terrible toxic boss. And it's weird. It's not that nice writing a villain, like a full villain. And maybe by the time I'm 50 more pages into this story, he won't be a villain anymore. I just think that generally when you spend enough time squinting at somebody, it's hard to villainize them. But yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
All right, I'm going to do 3 more questions, but 2 I'm going to combine because I think they speak to each other. So we'll start with Helen's question. Lee, you mentioned that you didn't get into writing as opposed to illustrating until fairly recently. However, I think your dialogue is super efficient and naturalistic in a way that I find a lot of prose writers have a hard time achieving. How did you teach yourself to write dialogue? And I know you touched on it a little bit. And then another person, where was it? Nadia asked, were certain characters' dialogue easier to write than others? If so, who came easiest to you? So just kind of combining those 2.
Nadia was in my cohort at the uni that I went to, that like 1-year course. And that's really nice praise coming from Helen, because Helen is a really good writer. Their book is also coming out this year with Metonymy Press. I mean, I think dialogue is just something I like. Like, I think other forms of writing that other people are super good at, like, you know, prose that conveys a lot of action, for example, and like conveys a lot of world building, like that's something I really enjoy reading and consuming in, I don't know, my spare time. But I don't know, I have no idea how to do that. So I think mostly I just focus on what I like and what I feel more intuitive doing. But I think maybe it was like a benefit of being a weird little loser with not many friends when I was younger, that I spent a lot of time like paying attention to people talking rather than being in the conversation myself. Also being around a lot of my parents' friends who were, you know, really interesting, fun people to listen to talk to. I just like listening to people talk. And so I think I notice dialogue when I don't like it, which helps me edit my own work. I think usually the first drafts of, you know, the streams of dialogues that I'm writing are not very good. And then I can read them again and figure out and troubleshoot it and just figure out what's not working and what feels like, I don't know, an alien pretending to be a person rather than an actual person. And also what's not dialogue that's pulling its weight, because there's like naturalistic dialogue and then there's actually how we talk, which I feel like are 2 different things. Like, I don't know if you ever tried to transcribe something, but people just speak like garbage most of the time. We interrupt ourselves and we say all sorts of in-between words that don't actually contribute to the conversation at all. And so writing naturalistic dialogue that isn't actually how we talk feels like a kind of balancing act. Anyway.
And which characters were easy to write?
Oh,
and which
yeah,
ones weren't?
true. Thank you. Well done. Ray was easy because she's basically just my voice, in my opinion. She's not me as a character, but I think she speaks mostly like me. Nessie was hard, as we've talked about before. Amanda was hard because in some ways she's of a similar age to us, but she's in a whole different world that I am not part of. That's just more heteronormative and more formal, I think, like more professional maybe. And it was tricky trying to write her in a way that still felt familiar and natural without swearing all the time or saying like and kinda and things that I'm happy to put in Ray's speech because it makes more sense for her character. So making her formal without making her sound like a total stick in the mud was tricky.
Okay, and then the last question is going to be from Yari J, because he always asks great questions.
He always asks great questions. He's famous for picking up the mic at a real life event and asking a great question.
Especially when no one else is asking. He's very brave. So he has 2 questions, but I'm going to pick this one. Is it different for you drawing non-white characters from white characters? If so, why? Specifically drawing, not writing.
Yeah, it's a good question. I was very obsessed with this earlier on, and I almost did a project on this actually, because I wanted to look at the history of the way that people of color are depicted in cartooning, considering that a lot of the cartooning archives are full of white cartoonists drawing people of color. And I'm talking about editorials as well. So like, you know, the diagonally inward slanting eyes of Asian characters was a white invention. And there's ways of tracking that through, I mean, I think particularly in Australian history when there was like a lot of yellow peril shit after the gold rush, it was just a way of identifying, like simplifying down racialized features so that they're immediately recognizable for a political agenda. And so I was very sus on, I guess, myself and on the history of cartooning to draw racialized features in a way that wasn't just like, I don't know, attaching to a history of hateful content, you know, but still ideally being recognizable enough that I'm not whitewashing people too. I think it's a tricky thing in general when features are trying, like, reduced as much as they are. And I think it's a thing to be sus on in myself and to be sus on as a reader, to figure out like why some characters look racialized and why they don't, like what codes people are using to interpret or to create certain characters' faces and bodies. I think I want it to be one aspect of how a character is racialized, but I want that to come across also in like many other ways, and through their dialogue and through, you know, their environments, through the ways in which they're reacting to other people around them and like making decisions in the world. Because I think like visual appearance is like one piece. Yeah, I'm still figuring out how to do it.
Well,
I guess time.
huh? No, it's perfect.
Yeah,
Um,
good enough.
Thanks everyone for the great questions.
Yes, thank you. What a good list.
And thank you both so much, Lee and Eli. That conversation was so wonderful. It was nice to get to spend a bit of time with both of you. And thank you everyone for your wonderful questions. And just a reminder that both Lee and Eli's books are available at Librairie, Drawn and Quarterly. We ship across Canada. Come get your books. We'll bring them to you on a bike, however you want. But both these books are really wonderful, and I can't recommend them enough. And thank you for coming. And everyone should have a nice night.
Bye everyone.
Bye.